good morning or afternoon, and welcome to my podcast. Today I'm going to talk about why Indigenous people want to reform First Nation Child and Family Services and what can we do to help them. So, historically, there have been many conflicts between Indigenous people and the child and family systems. From residential schools to the success school, Indigenous families have been torn apart and communities have been destabilized as a consequence of this. Today, we don't see discrimination to this extent, but many Indigenous people still feel that child and family services need a reform. There are still some areas where there is discrimination towards Native people or where they aren't fully equipped to deal with the specific necessities of their children or other families. A 20 billion deal to reform them was being negotiated between them and the Growing Society and Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, and the government. However, it has been left on a standstill since April of 2023. An agreement in principle was announced in December 2021. This is the stage during which the parties negotiate the issues set out in the framework agreement. A resolution that reflected the wishes of the First Nation chiefs was expressed in 2022. The waiting to receive actualization on these projects is usually long and tedious. The first complaint was filed in 2007. I was so surprised to read this. That is the year I was born, and since then there hasn't been a lot of progress, and the progress that's made is often restricted between elections and parties' conflicts. We should demand parties to reach an agreement in which they will respect the progress in this area and not destroy it to make the other look back at the cause of Indigenous families and communities. The leaders of both parties should compromise to respect the process to complete projects that were promised to vulnerable communities. Another reason for the delay is that the representative of Indigenous people in the current society withdrew from his charge without an explanation in September, and it was months until Canada hasn't found someone to find a solution, which further shows the inefficiency of the government. One of the reasons the government feels comfortable repeatedly delaying and breaking agreements and promises is because the general Canadian public isn't aware of all the demands and reforms that the government still owes and has promised to Indigenous people, so they don't expect any repercussions in their popularity for this. I believe most Canadians aren't racist and they don't want Indigenous people to remain excluded and vulnerable. I chose to be hopeful that the majority of Canadians wouldn't vote for someone they know is actively delaying agreements and failing to respond to demands in a decent time frame. And I invite you to be hopeful too. If the general public was more educated on this issue, there would be more pressure on politicians, and that can be done simply by expressing that Indigenous issues will be a key part in your decision to vote, or through public demonstration like protests. But what do Indigenous people want in the first place? Why do the child and family service or research need to improve? And how exactly is the government failing Indigenous people? I have talked about the waiting time and delays of the project, and also about how can we change that, but I haven't explained exactly what the reform will consist of. So, Indigenous children are overrepresented in the foster care system, and most of the time they are adopted by white families. The loss of family and cultural connections can be devastating to children in care. There should be more preventative measures in place so children don't need to be taken out of their homes and separated from their families and the community they know. The current system mainly focuses on attending the issue once it's at its last stages. It doesn't target the root causes enough. Poverty, poor housing, substance abuse, and mental health are the reasons why Indigenous children go into the housing system, and these are often caused by the intergenerational trauma of residential schools and other traumatic events that Native Americans have suffered. The goal of the reform would be that the child welfare systems help families to improve their conditions so they don't have to be torn apart. Another important change would be having more child welfare agencies that are led by Indigenous people. This way, there would be less racism and prejudices in the decision-making process, and there would be a deeper understanding of the necessities of the families. They will respect the culture of the child and make sure they are able to keep practicing it and use traditional knowledge and traditional forms of education. There should also be more emphasis of placing them with other family members if separation from parents is inevitable. Earlier, I mentioned that the general public having more awareness about the topic will create more pressure for the government to act. One thing I believe would be extremely helpful to measure the progress is doing annual reports on the number of indigenous children in child welfare and the reasons why. In conclusion, reforms to indigenous child welfare are the first priority in Canada's journey towards reconciliation. As colonialism has infantilized indigenous people and acted as if they should be in charge of indigenous communities, as in their view they were too savage to lead themselves, ensuring equitable funding for these indigenous-led agencies and recognizing that indigenous people can decide what's best for their own children will be a very important step in remedying the damage made.